Now, so we had been looking at JPEG and GIF, and in today's class we're going to look at how video is compressed and stored, but not without my screen. Okay. Now, this week in the labs I've been asking people to look at weeks 5, 6, 7 and 8 for the 10 blogs before them on the list. So the last time I asked you to do something like that, you looked at the 10 blogs after you on the list. And so if you see any spelling mistakes or typos or issues there, perhaps you could leave a comment for the author. That will give them the possibility of correcting those. I haven't corrected weeks 5, 6, 7 and 8. I was halfway through 5. So I haven't been correcting those as quickly as I would like. So there is still scope to fix mistakes in weeks 5, 6, 7 and 8. 1, 2, 3 and 4, or 2, 3 and 4, this is too late for those. So if you could do that, that would be good. Obviously it's sort of a community type thing. It only works if everybody does their bit. You might look at 10 people's and the other people might not look at yours, but for the most part it should work. So that can be a help, and it can be a way for you to get some feedback on your blog about the spelling and the grammar and stuff anyway, at least, without me, because I've been remiss, clearly. Another issue that has come up is the issue of people lifting work from other places and presenting it as their own. So that's come up from time to time. It's come up in the blogs where people, rather than write the blog entry themselves, basically just lift someone else's. Like, that to me represents an especially lazy form of it's especially lazy. You know, if you can't write about what you did last week without robbing someone else's work, you have a serious problem. And so also for the essays, just to remind you, I mean, I'm not going to spend a whole class going into what is plagiarism and what isn't. You can look that up. But, you know, the bottom line, if you're copying and pasting, if you're doing, you know, file copy, file paste, if that's in your plan for the day, then you're doing something you shouldn't be doing. And some people think that writing an essay is like making a patchwork quilt, where you know, take cloth from different places and then you stitch it together, and the work is in the stitching together. And while that stitching together is not a trivial task, it doesn't count. And so you have people asking, well, if I take something from the web, how much do I have to change it around so that it's okay? And that's missing the point. It's a bit like saying, if I rob a bank, how much money do I have to give to charity before it's okay? And there's just not any scenario in which it's okay. If you're going to Wikipedia, copying and pasting into Word, that's it. Doesn't matter what you do after that. There's nothing you can do that will make that be okay. So just so there's perfect clarity in that, you know, that won't fly. So if you want to try it, give it a go. But I would think the chances of you being caught are high. But it is a gamble. You take a chance. And you can read about the cost benefit. You know, obviously the cost is, you know, if you get away with it, you get the marks without having done the work. If you get caught, you can read about the possible penalties and stuff on the website from CIT. But people do get caught and they do get penalised. You generally don't hear about it because the confidentiality of the situation would prevent the lecturer telling you, and people who get caught generally don't go around advertising it. Whereas people who get away with it do. So you may get the impression that, based on the information you have, there's a good chance you get away with it. But generally, in general, people get caught, and statistically speaking, your chances of being caught by me are probably much higher than by anyone else, just based on past records. So that's information you can use and choose to ignore if you want. But so just be aware of that, okay? Now, Like I said, I could give a whole class now about that, and I'm not going to. Look it up, or don't. What we're going to talk about today is digital video compression. And the first thing we have to realize about video is that the way we think about digital video is a series of still images. So if you imagine you have a JPEG, you have an image followed by another image, followed by another image, followed by another image, followed by another image. And that's how we think of video. So when we're watching a video, we're not aware of the fact that it is a sequence of individual frames in rapid succession. Because it happens so quickly, we have the illusion of motion. But when someone kicks a football, we're not seeing the football moving. We see the football not moving, and then we see another picture of the football, but the ball has in a different place. And we see another picture of the football, a picture with a ball in a different place, and provided we see the frames in rapid enough succession, we don't notice that they're distinct. So typically you're talking about 24 frames a second or 25 frames a second. Animations can go as low as 12 or 13 or 14. Sometimes I think an episode of South Park is probably working at about 5 frames a second or something. But depending on the context, you can push it very low. So a Tom and Jerry cartoon might be done at less than 25 frames a second. But video, as we understand it, an episode of Mad Men, you're talking about 25 frames a second. And let's imagine then that we were watching a video at 640 by 480, which is quite modest. If you were watching video at something lower than that quality, you'd be thinking it's quite a small screen. If you opened up 640 by 480 on your laptop, it wouldn't fill the whole screen. So even at modest proportions, let's say you had 640 by 480, that's that many pixels. If you're going to have then 3 bytes per pixel, if it's going to be RGB, you're going to have that many bytes. And if you've got 25 of those a second, well, now you're up to something like 23 million bytes a second. So that's quite a lot of data to be handling every second. In the past, it would have been impossible for many devices to deal with those kind of data rates. It's possible now to deal with them, but it's not particularly desirable. You don't want to be dealing with 23 million bytes a second. If you consider how much you'd fit on a DVD, wouldn't be a whole lot. So video compression is essential if we want to do sensible things with it. And so when it comes to video compression then, we think about it at 2 different levels. So if we have a sequence of images, we've got 25 frames a second, we could take the first frame and compress that, and then take the next frame and compress that, and take the third frame and compress that, and take the fourth frame and compress that. So instead of having 25 uncompressed images every second, you have 25 compressed images a second. And they would look pretty much like JPEGs. So your video compression scheme would be, you've got 25 JPEGs a second. So where you are compressing a single frame, that's called intraframe compression. So it's within the individual frames. Interframe compression then exploits the fact that there's relationships, there's similarities between the frames. So with interframe compression, you're talking about, well, here I've got 15 pictures, I'm going to compress them somehow. So it's compressing them all together, not individually. And we'll see what we mean by that in a second. So intra means within, and inter means between. So if you shifted someone in the class, that's intra-class shifting. If you shifted someone in a different class, that's inter-class. So intra, inter. So intra is dealing with one frame at a time. Interframe compression deals with a bunch of frames together and compresses them as a group of frames. Now, just doing intraframe compression is quite reasonable, and there are times you might only want to do that. And so what your video compression, what your stream of compressed video looks like then is just a bunch of JPEGs one after the other. And you could see how that would work, and the compression ratio you'd get would be the equivalent of what you could do with one image converting it to a JPEG. But to get video down to really small sizes, you can do so much more. So when you use just JPEGs, or it's not quite a JPEG, but it's JPEG-ish anyway. When you just use JPEGs or just use intraframe compression, we sometimes call that motion JPEG or M.P.E.G. If you're going to be editing the video afterwards, for example, you might just save it as M.P.E.G in the short term. Now, let's look at this frame of video here, and then I have another one from a short time afterwards. Now, these aren't even 1/25th of a second apart. These are quite far apart time-wise. But you can see that between one frame and the next, very little has in fact changed. And that's a feature we can use. Okay, you've got 25 frames a second and they're all different. But I mean, if they were really different, if you actually had 25 completely different images every second, sure, your head would explode. You couldn't watch that. So there are 25 images every second, but they're not that different from one to the next. They can't be. Now, depending on the context, it may be different, it may be not. The difference is there may be more or less. You know, I mean, music videos there tends to be lots of jumping around, moving around, and flashing lights. You know, The Matrix would have lots of movement. But something more relaxed, like the news, you know, between one frame and the next, not a whole lot's changing. So here in Photoshop, I've exaggerated or highlighted the parts that are different from one frame to the next. And so the light parts are the parts that have changed, and the dark parts are the parts that haven't changed that much. So if there isn't much change between, say, frame 2 and frame 1, if much hasn't changed, then you don't need to send all of frame 2. If the receiver already has frame 1, then you can just say, well, you know, you have frame 1, frame 2 looks a lot like frame 1, except these parts are different. And just send the different parts. So if we have frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, frame 4, and frame 5, very little is changing between the frames. Now, obviously, this is a contrived example. Although, you know, South Park looks like this. I mean, South Park is a video compression algorithm's dream. Because the frame rate is slow and people just move, sort of shuffle along from side to side, you know. Whereas something with explosions or fountains, things going to warp, you know, generally worst case scenarios. So when very little changes between one frame and the next, the current frame can be constructed by you reusing parts of the previous frame. So the portion I've highlighted in red there, well, it's red on my screen. What color is that even? Yeah, the portion I've highlighted there, that has stayed the same, and only the area in blue has changed. So that represents, I think, I don't know, maybe about 1/5 maybe even 1/6 of the image has changed. So there would be no need, having sent frame 1 to the receiver, to then send all of frame 2. You could just say, well, you know, the top part of frame 2 and the bit on the left there, that's the same as in frame 1. And then this bottom right part here, that's just changed. So only sending the updates represents a huge saving in terms of cost. Now, it's much simpler to think of this as a transmission rather than storing on a disk. But it amounts to the same thing. But in terms of visualizing it, it's easier to visualize. You have a transmitter sending an image, sending a video to a receiver. And it just helps to think of it that way. So if the receiver already has frame 1, you can say, well, you know, frame 2 is the same as frame 1, but just with these small changes. And then just send the changes. What are the changes? So change this bit, move this, change this here, change that there. And so you could imagine how that might be successful. And so if you can imagine that, you can understand how video compression works in principle. By exploiting the fact that very little changes between one frame and the next, you can reduce the amount of data you need to send. So hold on to that thought. All I'm going to do now in the rest of the class is explain the mechanics of how you actually do that. And some of it is ingenious. Some of it is some of the cleverest stuff I've ever seen, and I'm sick that I didn't invent it. No. So you can say frame 2 is the same as frame 1, both these small changes. Frame 3 is the same as frame 2, except for these small changes. Frame 4 is the same as frame 3, except for these parts, and so on. Now, eventually, actually, you do eventually stop and say, look, okay, we, pushed the boat out there now. Here it is. Now we start again. So every so often you actually do start again. But you can get quite far with this. And coding the differences between frames uses a lot less data than coding each individual frame, again from scratch. Now, it turns out when you're specifying the parts that have changed, addressing each individual pixel is too expensive. So what you do is you break the current frame up into non-overlapping blocks, and then you do it on a block-by-block basis, and you look then at the blocks, and only the blocks that have changed significantly from one frame to the next get transmitted. So you could maybe just make out there on your screens, there's a different color there. So like you only look at the ones that have changed a lot and send those, and you leave the rest. So blocks that haven't changed, you just say, well, that's the same as the past frame. And in fact, you probably even have some threshold. So if it changes by a significant amount, will you resend the block? Otherwise, you might say, close enough. And in video compression, we actually do a lot of close enough, because this is all happening again at 1/25th of a second. Do you know, if you cut corners here and there, well, it's only going to be visible for 1/25th of a second. Not the end of the world. So the update this part of the screen or not happens on a block-by-block basis. And that's because doing it on an individual pixel-by-pixel basis, you just use up so many bits addressing the actual thing you're talking about would be worse than sending the data. No. This now is where it gets really, really interesting and really, really clever. And this is where it starts to get a bit mind-blowing. Okay? And again, I have no color. This is unfortunate now. So perhaps I'll show you the color screen and I'll look at the dodgy screen. So if we look here on the right, in the current frame, we have a block there in orange. And when you compare that to the same spot in the previous frame, it's completely different. And it's completely different because the car is moving. So if you look at the tree, you know, the tree part, block by block, each block in the current frame is the same as the previous frame. But when we look at the back wheel there of the car in the current frame, when we look at the equivalent block in the previous frame, it's different. So you might be thinking, oh well, we tried, tough, we'll just have to resend that block. But no, this is where it gets clever. Yes, that block in the previous frame is very different from that block in the current frame, but the information that we're looking for in order to assemble the current frame is in fact in the previous frame. It's just moved. It's there. It's not where we were expecting to find it, but it is there. And so what motion compensation video compression does is it compares the block in the current frame with that position in the previous frame. And if there's no change, yip-de-doo, it says, okay, transmitter, that's the same as it was before. If it's different, it doesn't send it just yet. It actually has a poke around to see if it can find the information it's looking for, find the block it's looking for in the previous frame. And if it finds it, then it says to the transmitter, okay, you actually have this block already, it's just moved like up 20 and over 16 or something. And it turns out the chances of finding the information that you're looking for are quite high. Because like, where could it have gone in a 25th of a second? So a lot of the time, even if the contents of the previous frame at the position of the block we're coding in the current frame are very different, they are actually available somewhere in the previous frame. You just have to have a poke around and look for them. And so then the transmitter sends to the receiver the coordinates, so to speak, of the missing block. Any questions on that? I'm in danger now of just saying it all over and over and over and over again, which isn't really helpful. Any questions on that? So that's tremendously clever, I think. Now, generally, the notion that motion compensation will work, it'll only apply in certain conditions. There are scenarios in which it breaks down. Like I said, South Park, best case scenario, sure, everyone walks along like this. You know, so I mean, you know, finding pieces of someone's head or someone's clothing as they're moving across the screen is very easy. As long as objects move parallel to the camera, you're doing well. If things start zooming in and out, then it doesn't work so well. But even then, within a 25th of a second, how far can they zoom in and out? How much can it change really? If there's rotation, that's more difficult. So like, if I move over here, well, you can still find my face from one frame to the next. But if I'm turning, well, you know, trying to make my ear out of my nose, you know, on a good day anyway, shouldn't be too possible. Okay? Also, if the illumination is changing. So, I mean, if you're in a disco and there's like strobe lights and stuff, well, you know, from one frame to the next, there could be many, many changes. And the information may not be there. Or you can imagine if the car was to drive you know, from darkness into light, if there's a street light and the car is driving under it, well, again, the motion compensation isn't going to work so well. And of course, if one object is behind another and then is revealed, that can be quite tricky. So even if I walk like this, okay, and don't turn around and the illumination is uniform and I don't rotate, if there was a rabbit behind me on the chair, on the stool here, well, like, good luck making that rabbit out of my shirt. You know, that's just totally new information. No amount of motion compensation could account for that. So this is something that doesn't work very well in theory, but works really well in practice, because we're at the 1/25th of a second level. So even if something is rotating, how much can it spin in 1/25th of a second? So this can hold quite well. Any questions on that? So we're reusing blocks from frame 1 to make frame 2. And even if we move, we try and track them down so we can reuse them. This is now where the plot thickens considerably. So, looking here at frame 2, we're trying to construct frame 2 having already sent frame 1. So the receiver now has frame 1, and we're saying, okay, you know, top row blocks there, no change. Top row blocks there, no change. No change, no change, no change, no change, no change. And then when it comes to where the car is moving, the transmitter says to the receiver, okay, that block is actually moved, but the piece of information you're looking for, the block you're looking for, is so many pixels over, so many pixels up, whatever. In this case, it's actually just moving horizontally, so it wouldn't be any pixels up, just over. But if we consider that chunk of grass there, well, like, you know, that's not in frame 1. That's completely new information. And so it's not a question of that clump of grass that we need to construct frame 2 being available in frame 1, but it's moved around a bit. It's just not there. So you might say, okay, well, we tried, so we'll just have to send that block. But no. The clever folks at, you know, Video Compression Incorporated. Now, these techniques were developed over years, by the way, but realized that, yeah, sure, it's not there in frame 2, but, you know, it is in frame 3. So you're still trying to make frame 2, and most of what you need to make frame 2 is in frame 1. That grass there was a bit of a problem. It wasn't in frame 2, so it wasn't in frame 1, but it is in frame 3. So if you had a system that allowed blocks to be copied, that allowed frames to be built using blocks from both past frames and future frames, well, sure, you'd be on the pig's back, like. You could really do quite well. And so that's how video compression is actually so successful. So MPEG uses what it calls bidirectional prediction, or B-frames, to achieve this. What time is it there, guys? Quarter. Okay. No. So M.P.E.G stands for Motion Picture Experts Group, and this is an ISO standard. Flush from the success of JPEG, the ISO decided to take on the plethora of video compression standards, or not standards as the case may be. And in MPEG, we have what we call iframes. These use intraframe compression. And they, for the most part, look like JPEGs, actually. So we call them iframes. Then the frames that use interframe compression, so frames that are built up using parts of previous frames, we call those P frames or predicted frames. And we can see how they often fit together. So iframes are standalone and they don't depend on any other frames. Predicted frames use interframe compression and they reuse blocks, reuse data from a previous I or P frame. B frames then are the bidirectional ones. And B frames are like P frames, but they reuse data from both a past I or P frame and a future I or P frame. Now, they never actually rely on other B frames because that would degrade the quality very, very quickly. So they don't depend on each other, but they use a past IRP frame and a future IRP frame. So iframes are the largest of them. They're basically like JPEGs. So you might be talking about a compression ratio of maybe like 3:1 or something. P frames can be quite a lot smaller because the P frame only has to send any information that's new. So a P frame is saying this frame is the same as the previous frame, and the size of the P frame is related to the amount of new information. B frames can be much, much smaller because if you're looking at past frames and future frames and you're taking those as your source, well, you know what's really new? Not a whole lot. There can't be that much new. So B frames tend to be very, very small. And it's the P frames and B frames that give you the spectacular compression ratios we get for video that allow things like YouTube and digital television and DVDs and digital video as we know it. The fact that so little changes between one frame and the next, the ability to exploit that property of video is where we get all those savings. So any questions on that? It gets worse. No. So I've illustrated here as best I can in color the dependencies here between the frames. So we can see here that frame 1 is an I frame. Frame 2 is a B frame, and it's reusing parts of frame 1 and reusing blocks from frame 4. Frame 3 similarly is a B frame, and it's using that past I frame and that future P frame. Frame 4, on the other hand, is a P frame. So it only uses information from a past I or P frame. It never uses information from a future frame. And so frame 5 then is a B frame. So again, it's using a past and future frame. Frame 6 is using a past and future frame. And frame 7 is using just one past, in this case, P frame. So P frames can depend on one past P frame or I frame. I frames are standalone, they don't rely on anything. And B frames use a past I or P frame and a future I or P frame, but never another B frame. Now, this is the part then that really blows people's minds, okay? So let's say now this is our video and we're going to send it from A to B. So we send frame 1. The receiver gets frame 1 can look at it and display it straight away. It's happy out with frame 1. That's a standalone frame. It doesn't rely on anything else for its construction. It's a complete package. Let me send frame 2. Now, frame 2 is built up using parts of frame 1 and parts of frame 4. But of course, the receiver doesn't have frame 4 quite just yet. So it can't construct frame 2. Frame 2 is constructed from parts of frame 1 and parts from frame 4. It needs both 1 and 4 in order to build 2. So 2 can't be sent. We have to send 4 next. Frame 4 is constructed using parts of frame 1. So when the instructions for building frame 4 arrive, the receiver can say, oh yeah, well I have frame 1, and to make frame 4, I do ding, 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 ding with frame 1. Okay, I'm done. Once the receiver has frame 1 and frame 4, only then can we transmit frame 2 and frame 3. So the dependency between the frames requires them to be transmitted in an order that's different to the order in which they'd be displayed. And that usually wrecks people's heads. So what has to go next? Frame 7. Has to be frame 7. And now that you have 4 and 7, you can send 5 and 6.
Are 5 and 6 instructions rather than actual?
Yes. That's a good way to think about the P frames and the B frames. They're not standalone pictures. They're instructions for assembling a picture using the ones you already have. Now, as part of the instructions, they may include, blocks of pixels. But the data is primarily instructions. And so you can imagine sending the locations of blocks to be cut and paste from one frame to the next. That data takes up a lot less information than the actual block itself would. And so that's where the savings comes from. One more thing. The dependencies between the frames then make it very susceptible to noise. If you lose a frame, then all of the frames that depend on that are also lost. So there can be a kind of a cascade effect. So you sometimes see that if your signal drops, if you're like, say you have terrestrial television at home, or you've got Sky, and something, your dish gets a gust of wind or something, it can degrade quite rapidly. Sometimes you can even see it trying to sort of reassemble the blocks. You see the blocks you see things in the wrong place. Bits of feet where their heads would be and stuff and things like that. And that's because the information was corrupted, and so it's applying the correct instructions to bad data. That's why every so often then we just send a new iframe. So usually every 15, 20 frames, maybe less, maybe more, depending on how you want to push it, we just say, okay, that was great, good work lads. Now we're going to start all over again. Here's a new iframe. And that iframe stands alone. And then you can hang stuff off that P frames and B frames, and then yip-de-doo, okay, now we start again. And so you call those iframes our key frames. So if you have a package at home that allows you to compress video, when you go into the advanced options, you'll see the option to specify all of these kinds of things. How often you have your iframes, your P frames if you have a program for ripping DVDs so you can watch them on your iPad or your Apple TV or whatever, you find that it may enable you to set all these things individually. You know, what pattern do you have for the P frames and the B frames? So all that can be set. So now you know lots about video compression, perhaps more than most people.